So we have one of our more difficult Bazaar challenges today. Actually, maybe it's technically the easiest, but also they made it the most difficult. As per usual, this is a Bazaar build out of context where we give our Bazaar community an item to build around. Then they have to come up with the best build that they can over the course of a couple of days without using any buffing items or any permanent buffs to items. No hero skills, no hero stats, nothing. It is out of context. This one in particular, however, is a neutral item. So it was up to them to pick a class to build around, and of course, they chose the hardest one. A Dooley build, a rare, wild Dooley build that I've been very excited to jump into. So we have the Spiked Buckler, the Power Sander, the Core, Titanium, Capacitor, and Claw in this build. Going to go through each of them in order because our first and our sort of target item that we had to build around is the Spiked Buckler, and that was first. So, starting with Spiked Buckler, which is the new item. Now, this is a neutral item, not just a Dooley item, but I did give the guys a pass and said, with neutral items, feel free to use them on any class that you want, because we will eventually be able to use them on any class that we want. And typically, they're not quite as strong, but there are some super strong ones out there, and let's see if we were able to build around this properly. So, the Spiked Buckler. This medium weapon, every 9 seconds, deals 6 damage and grants you 6 shielding. All in all, a good start, a decent item. 6 damage every 9 seconds isn't exceptional, but 6 shielding as well. That not only gives it just higher value in general, 6 damage, 6 shielding, it's kind of like 6 anti-damage, if you really consider it, but also gives it more diversity. This will trigger anything with weapons, this will trigger anything with shield, damage. It's a medium item, it can trigger a lot of different things and a lot of different keywords will interact with it. Which, without further ado, as we hop along in the build to Power Sander, we will see an example of, and it's worth talking about these two as a couple. The Power Sander is a small tool which every 7 seconds grants your shielding items plus 4 shielding. And then, as a passive, it gives you plus 3 armor permanently. So, a handy little weapon, a handy little tool, not a weapon, that grants you 3 armor straight off the bat, so you'll start the fight with 3 shielding. That's important for the rest of this build, as you'll see in a second. Actually, as you'll see a bit later on, because I've had a sneaky peek at some of these items, and I'm starting to recognize more of them just by their pictures. Power Sander and Spiked Buckler obviously have quite nice synergy. Power Sander, being at 7-second cooldown, is going to trigger before Spiked Buckler, so your first Spiked Buckler isn't 6 damage and 6 shielding, it's actually 6 damage and 10 shielding. By the time it triggers a second time, 6 damage and 14 shielding, and so on and so forth. And at some point, because there's a 2-second differential between Spiked Buckler and Power Sander, we're going to get plus 14 between activations. But it'll be quite far into the fight at that point. And it's somewhat negligible. I mainly just want to draw on the fact that we have a nice sort of bit of synergy between these two items. And that's something we've spoken about in the past with these builds, where it's important with these builds to think of how you're going to reach its potential. How long through your game will it take for this build to actually start to take off? And these like little sort of couple of items that pair really well together, these are ideal for even remotely spotting this build, let alone pivoting to it and building it up, right? If you have a Spiked Buckler from one of your early encounters, and you see a Power Sander, or more importantly, you see a merchant that sells small items like Andy, or maybe a tools merchant if Dooley gets one of those, you can target that merchant, go to that merchant, hope to find a Power Sander, bring this combo together, and you already have quite a nice sort of core combo. As Dooley has a core, funny joke. Anyway, haha. Once you have that core combo, you can then start adding the pieces on together. Maybe you build something else entirely in your other spaces, and you just sort of work with these for the time being because they work nicely together. So, beautiful little combo there of Spiked Buckler and Power Sander. The next item along is, as anyone who is familiar with Dooley, and if you're not, we'll get into that in a bit, will know, the core. This is Dooley's core item. he cannot get, well, actually, can he get rid of this? I'm pretty sure he can't get rid of this, and if he could, he shouldn't. The core is an item that Dooley starts with, and it is the main item in which he is building around. It's kind of like his entire central mechanic. So the core is a medium core weapon, which every 12 seconds does 10 damage and advances all items to its right by 1 second. To its right are titanium, the capacitor, and claw. Its passive is that when you use any item to the left, advance this by 1 second, which is the spiked buckler and power sander combo that we've just been through. Those are at 7 and 9 seconds respectively, or invertly, I guess. And the core is at 12 seconds. So at 7 seconds, power sander will trigger, core's passive, bringing it down to an 11-second cooldown. Well, it will currently be at a 5-second cooldown. It will lose 1 second and that bring it down to 4. Then in 2 more seconds, when there's only 2 seconds left on the core, spiked buckler will trigger its passive, bring it down to a 1-second cooldown, and then the core will trigger. So core, power sander, and spiked buckler have a really nice little combo going along. The only way this could be made better is if you had another item to the left at either at anything less than 12 seconds. So the core has obviously another half to it. First of all, it does a chunk of damage, only 10 to begin with, but that will add up eventually. And it advances all of the items to its right by 1 second. Now, remember that, because the next item only has a passive. So it's really the other 2 items. So the next item, which isn't going to get buffed by the core at all, actually buffs the core, and that's titanium. This medium item grants you 30 armor, and gives the core plus 5 damage. Great. We've already spoken about how we are charging the core quite effectively. It's going to be triggering every 10 seconds currently. And now dealing 15 damage. That's way more than a damage a second. Which is pretty nice for the core. Especially considering it is still doing all of its advancing business. 30 armor is also nice. It gives us that nice beefy start to the fight. We're going to actually start now with 33 permanent armor, thanks to 33 armor turned into shielding at the beginning. 3 of that armor is permanent, 30 of that is attached to titanium. But thanks to the power sander and titanium, we're going to have a big chunk of armor to start the game with, which will turn into shielding. So we are going to be able to withstand those early attacks from the enemy, which I may or may not agree with in a moment, but we'll get there. This titanium is important for getting the core to deal more damage at least. Next up is the capacitor, which every 7 seconds advances the right item by 2 seconds. It is a small attachment. And as it might sound, this attachment is basically a buffing item. So every 7 seconds, but not quite 7 seconds, because every 10 seconds it gets advanced by 1 second. So this is like every 6 point, what would it lean into? It would lean more to the latter, so it'd be like 6.66 or whatever. Somewhere in that ballpark. I'm not going to do the actual maths, because there'll be speed and stuff applied anyway. But yeah, capacitor, between 6 to 7 seconds cooldown to charge the item to its right by 2 seconds. So we can obviously only talk about the capacitor really in conjunction with the claw, although I will say capacitor, another great sort of building block of Dooley's items. Advance the right item by 2 seconds is a pretty decent passive, or active, I guess, in this case. But it's a pretty decent buff that you can just put in most places and it won't feel too bad. So if you already had Spiked Buckler Power Sander and you picked up Capacitor, there's no reason why you couldn't put this Capacitor to the left of Power Sander, or even to the left of Spiked Buckler, so long as Power Sander was triggering first. Made sure that Power Sander was to the left of Spiked Buckler, for example. Because it just makes all of your items better. There's no sort of, like I said, there's no sort of bad way to use it. So it's a nice little building block. It's not like you're going to have some dead space in your build. while you're trying to put it together. If you find Capacitor and grab it expecting to make this build, you could always pivot into something else because Capacitor will aid it rather than work against it. So, that being said, the Claw, the last item in this build, this medium attachment weapon, every 9 seconds deals 15 damage. This gets plus 5 damage for the fight, assumedly, when your shield breaks, which is when your shield goes to 0 and you start taking damage to your health. This item brings the build together. I am so glad this item is here. I personally almost skipped over the build, even though it's a Dooley build and I was very excited by it. The Claw really, really makes it for me. Let's talk about the positives of the Claw, in this build especially. Every 9 seconds, we are adding an amount of shielding, and it's getting stronger as the fight goes on, which is great because you'll need that to survive. This build doesn't have a crazy damage spike. It doesn't need to take hits to its shielding, which the Power Sander will help it do. It does also need that shielding to break so that Claw can trigger and do more damage, but it's important that we live so that happens. So, Spiked Buckler and Claw work very nicely together. Spiked Buckler will trigger just before Claw, which in speed ties might be nice, but I'm not sure. I think we're just going to leave that one out because I don't know if that's that important. What is important is that by the time Claw triggers, the enemy should have cleared through your starting shielding, and then Spiked Buckler should trigger, giving you 10 more shielding, which the enemy should easily breeze through. And then the next time the Claw comes around to trigger, it's already doing like 25 damage. And that continues on through the fight. Your shielding goes up, you take a hit, some of your health gets chipped away, but not much. The Claw gets stronger. Your shielding goes up. Some of your health gets chipped along with that shielding, Claw gets stronger. Claw triggers, massive damage, so on and so on and so on. That's the general premise of this build, and that's really, really good for the small number of Dooley items that we have available to us. Bravo on that. I would like to see Titanium removed from this to guarantee that early +5 to Claw damage. I think it's a toss-up, really. It's a 50-50, right? If you leave Titanium in, your core gets stronger, which will be triggering about every 10 seconds. But if you take it out, your Claw, those words sound quite similar in my accent. The core and claw. The core and claw. The claw triggers every 9 seconds, and the core triggers every 10 seconds, so they're kind of close. I personally think Titanium being removed, because of the 3 permanent armor from Power Sander, that is such a brilliantly, just perfect combo with Claw, because you only have 3 armor. You can almost guarantee the enemy can do 3 damage in 9 seconds. And if they can't, you've probably won anyway. Or you're playing, like, Jules or some sort of poison build. Or a max health Pygmalion build. Or something like that. Regardless, they should be able to do 3 damage very, very easily. Titanium, on the other hand, having 30 armor, so you have 30 shielding to start with, that's going to take some chunking through. It really is. So I am leaning towards taking it out. However, like I said, it works perfectly well with it in. I would say if you're going to leave the core in, if you're going to leave Titanium in, and core is your central item, I would then take Capacitor and the Claw, move it to the other side of the core, so you've committed then to a core-centric build, and that would give your core potentially 2 more triggers. It would make it a little out of whack with the maths we did earlier, but it would give your core more triggers, and your core would start to carry more of the damage. And then if you went the other way, and you were using Claw as your main combo, you could move Spike Buckler and Power Sander to the right of core to get more damage out of it that way. Or to get more shielding from Spike Buckler, which means it could be removed more regularly, which means claw could get stronger, etc. So, I think this build is near completion. If we had some more Dooley items, this would almost definitely be a strong contender. This build is really quite nice. I like it. It's got really good build paths. Really nice, like, few core synergies, like the claw plus power sander, great combo. Spiked buckler plus power sander, great combo. Titanium plus core, great combo. Capacitor plus anything, great combo. Really, really easy building blocks. And for me, I think that's what brings this up from maybe a 3 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5. Because it's such a nice, easy build to create and be effective. And from there on, once you've got that effective build together, and when we get some better Dooley items to look at, that's when we can push this build further in one of those other directions. For the time being, you did absolutely as well as you could. So, we mentioned a little bit earlier on in that the core is such an important bit of Dooley's kit. Well, luckily for you, we go over the entirety of the core in our top 5 Dooley item breakdown, along with some of the other items we talk about in this build. So, definitely one worth a watch if you want to understand a little bit more about how our little round robot friend works.